We're going to be talking about persecution this session. And the persecution that was faced by the early church, but we're also going to be talking a little bit about some of the persecution going on around the world. How many of you know that Christians are being heavily targeted all around the world right now, especially in certain nations and so on? I was preaching last August in a certain heavily, predominantly Muslim nation, and got to see some people come to the Lord and things like that, and got to interact with some young, very, very young believers, brand new. And in that particular nation, if any of their family finds out about them becoming Christian, they'll basically be killed. And they will work, once they've been born again, they will work to smuggle them out of that nation into another nation where they can kind of serve Jesus openly and have a lot better chance of survival. And so we live in a very interesting world. But my daughter wrote a song a few years ago called Even Unto Death. And it's based on the verse in Revelation. It says, and they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto the death. And it talks about the martyrs. And I was kind of shocked. My daughter's a wonderful young lady. She's got a full-time traveling ministry. She's a worship leader. But I was pleasantly surprised at her grasp of understanding something that, you know, the martyrs of the Old Testament and the martyrs of the New Testament. And it's really a song written in dedication to them. We're going to pick up with persecution. We said as we were closing the other day, there are basically three types of persecution that the early church faced. The first, and the one that is shown the most in the book of Acts, is Jewish persecution. You know, who were these young upstarts that were claiming that Jesus was the Messiah? You know, the Bible says that Jesus came to his own, and his own received him not. And so, you know, from the earliest days, the Jewish religious establishment did not like that Jesus was being proclaimed as the Messiah. And they exercised their power and control that they had by virtue of being in the majority to persecute early believers. We read about that, you know, very extensively in the book of Acts. And then there was what we called pagan persecution, which means, you know, non-Jewish, non-Christian, people who were idol worshipers, people who worshiped all the gods of the Greek and the Roman pantheon. They would sometimes persecute the Christians, like we saw in Acts chapter 19. The people who made the silver little statues of Artemis, so many people in Ephesus got born again that people quit buying the shrines. And so the silver makers, you know, didn't want their business to go out, so they filled up that huge stadium with a riot, great as Artemis of the Ephesians. And it was pretty much after that that Paul got out of town. At that point, he was going to be more of a distraction to the church. He was a big target. And so Paul continued on, and the church carried on, you know, without Paul being there as the leader. And then finally, what we're going to look at today is imperial persecution, or persecution by the Roman government. Let's take a look at this in Acts chapter 25, verse 9. You know, Paul faced persecution from the Jews. Paul himself had been a Jewish persecutor. As a matter of fact, he was the fiercest Jewish persecutor of all, and that's what made his conversion so dramatic. When Paul got born again, Saul of Tarsus, Saul is his Hebrew name, Paul is his Greek or Roman name, his Gentile name. When Paul got born again, wasn't Gentiles, just a Greek name. When Paul got born again, nobody in the church believed he had gotten saved. They all thought, this is just a trick. He's pretending to be saved. And so he's going to come in and buddy up to us, and then he's going to find out who we are, where we are, and then he's going to, you know, rain terror down on us. And who was the only person that believed in Paul? Barnabas. Barnabas believed in Paul when nobody else believed in Paul. And I can just imagine the day in Jerusalem when Barnabas knocks on the door and the 12 apostles are meeting there. And Barnabas says, "Hey guys, I've got a new friend I want you to meet." And just kind of like, Barnabas, you know. So anyway, but Paul became the greatest apostle of the early church by far. He outstripped all of the rest in labors and fruit and things of that nature. But he had been arrested in Jerusalem. I think this is in Acts chapter 21. And they almost killed him there around the temple. And then there was a plot to kill him. And Paul's nephew came and said, "Hey, there's a plot against Paul." So they took him over to a prison in Caesarea on the coast of Israel. And Paul was there for a few years, and he stood trial before, I don't remember the exact order, there was Festus and Agrippa, and now he's finally before, or Felix and Agrippa, and now he's before Festus. And notice this, what it says. Then Festus, he was the Roman representative, wanting to please the Jews, asked him, "Are you willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there?" And Paul said, "No, Paul did not want to go back to Jerusalem. He knew they had made vows to kill him there. And Paul said, "No, this is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried here. You know very well I am not guilty of harming the Jews. If I have done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I am innocent, no one has a right to turn me over to these men to kill me." And notice what Paul says, "I appeal to Caesar." I appeal to Caesar. Paul had more confidence in the Roman system than he did in the Jewish system. And I think too, Paul had an agenda. Part of his original calling from God was to bear witness before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. So Paul was ordained by God and even here, Festus and Agrippa and Felix, Paul ministered to people in high places. And now he appeals to Caesar. That's what Acts chapter 28 is all about. Acts 27, they take Paul by ship across the Mediterranean. Acts chapter 28, he shows up in Rome. He meets with Roman leaders there. And you know what all of us are Jewish leaders in Rome. And you know what all of a sudden? The book of Acts abruptly stops. Just finishes. There's no formal ending. And there's much speculation. Why does it stop right there? It just seems like it just kind of stops and we don't know what happened there. Well, we know from history some of the things that happened, but I really believe that one of the reasons the book of Acts just seems to stop suddenly is the gospel had started in Jerusalem. It has made it to Rome. That's what the book of Acts is all about, getting the gospel from the Jewish world to the Gentile world. It's now made it to the capital of the Gentile world, Rome, the head of the Roman Empire. But what happens then, Paul gets there, stands trial. We believe that Paul is released from that trial, the one that follows Acts 28, and that he's actually released and that he actually travels some additional journeys, perhaps to Spain, perhaps to Crete, some other places, and that he probably writes 3 letters after his imprisonment in Acts 28, and that is 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are probably the 3 letters written after his imprisonment. But what happens is now begins an era of what we're going to call imperial persecution. Does anybody know where this is? This is the Colosseum in Rome. Paul never saw this. It was built, I think, in the year 81, but a lot of Christians were put to death there. Now, some people will argue and say, well, there's no official Roman record of Christians being put to death there. There's perhaps not, but there are records of criminals being put to death there. Christians were considered criminals. And the church records, church history is full of Christians being fed to the lions, put to death here, and so on. I told you the other day about the place where Paul was beheaded. You know, the myth is that his head bounced 3 times. This is the place, that little building at the end is a little church built over the place that they believe that Paul was beheaded. And we talked the other day about Peter was crucified and Paul was beheaded. Do you know why they each died the way they died? Because Paul was a Roman citizen, and it was illegal to crucify a Roman citizen. Now, Paul had never been to Rome before Acts 28. Paul was born in, you remember Saul of Tarsus. Tarsus is in modern day Turkey. But Paul's father had obtained Roman citizenship. Different people all around the Roman Empire, if they were extremely privileged, were able to obtain Roman citizenship. It had lots of benefits. And because Paul was a Roman citizen, the law required that if he's going to be executed, it be done by beheading. Why was that preferred? It was relatively quick and painless compared to crucifixion. Peter was not a Roman citizen. And because Peter was not a Roman citizen, that's why he was crucified. This is a statue of the Emperor Domitian. On the left, on the right is a tour guide. The Emperor Domitian is the one that sent the Apostle John to exile in Patmos. We're going to talk about Domitian here in a minute when we look at some of the different Roman emperors that persecuted. But that statue was about 27 feet high, 27 feet tall. And it was placed strategically so that when you sailed into the harbor of ancient Ephesus, you saw this huge statue of Domitian, 27 feet high. All that remains today is the bust, the head, and part of his left arm, it looks like, and hand. But John would have seen that specific statue. Paul would not have. Paul was already dead. Timothy would have seen that exact statue. And the reason that John got sent to the island of Patmos is because what the Romans tended to do was when an emperor died, they would deify him. And people would have to burn incense and, pay homage in worship to the Roman emperors. But Domitian, I believe, was the very first emperor that was not content to wait until he died to become deified. And so he proclaimed himself while he was still alive that he was Lord and God. And to not suffer persecution, everybody in the empire had to go before a statue of him and burn a pinch of incense and say these 3 simple words, "Caesar is Lord." Well, guess what? That's a problem for the early Christians. They wouldn't do it. And so Domitian sent John out to the island of Patmos, but that's a statue of him. That is in the Ephesus Museum today. That is the island of Patmos right there. That's a monastery up on top of the island of Patmos that was built over what they think may have been the cave where John was taking refuge while he was in exile for 18 months on the island of Patmos. And they believe that it was perhaps in that cave that's right under the monastery, the big structure on top. By the way, that monastery was built in the year 1088, and it was built on top of the ruins of an old Artemis temple. So, and one thing you'll know, this is just a random thing from church history. When the church began to get steam and strength and acquire property and so on, many times they would simply take over an abandoned temple and they would turn that into their church. Or they would build a church right on top of an old Greek pagan temple. So that's where John would have spent time under Domitian. That's another view. That's a view from the monastery up on top of the island. How would you like to be exiled there for 18 months? It's actually a beautiful island. Patmos is gorgeous. But I'm sure John was not there under very good circumstances. I want to tell you about this. When you go into the monastery on the island of Patmos, the monastery was built in the year 1088. And in the monastery, they have a lot of ancient artwork. This to me is one of the most I'm not a big art person, but this to me is extremely moving. This is a story. So many of the early church paintings were there for illustration and teaching purposes. You know, things that people eventually began to pray to and venerate and things like that were originally designed simply to be teaching tools, because the majority of the people in the ancient world were illiterate. They couldn't read. So the artists would do paintings like this and paintings of Paul and Jesus and all that to tell the story. So people could walk around the church. They couldn't read the Bible. They probably didn't have a Bible because the printing press had not been invented. So the only Bibles were handwritten copies. And it might be that your church would own a copy of some of the New Testament, maybe not all, but certain letters. But typically, individuals didn't have their own personal Bible. So people would go to church, and because they couldn't read and they didn't have a Bible anyway, they would walk around the church and they'd see all these paintings and the paintings would tell all these stories. And that was one of the teaching tools. Now later, people began to pray before them and venerate them and things of that nature, and they got kind of weird. But these were originally teaching tools. What you see there is a bunch of guys, and they're not very well. You can see they don't have much clothing on. This guy right here, you see the bones and all that? You can see these guys have been somewhat tortured and things like that. Who is this up at the top? That's Jesus up at the top. And what are these floating over their heads? These are crowns. Now, this is an actual story that happened. It was when Constantine was the emperor in the west of the Roman Empire. And there was and Constantine favored the Christians. But there was another emperor in the east. They'd had kind of a split in the kingdom, and Constantine, who favored the Christians, was over in Rome. But there was a guy named Licinius, who was the emperor in the east, more the area of Byzantium and so on. And they had agreed together that they would not persecute Christians, but Licinius got real paranoid, and he thought the Christians were out to overthrow his government. And so he issued a decree that any Christian should be forced to worship the Roman gods, to prove their loyalty to the Roman state. There was an army, I can't think of the name, they were called the Thundering Legion. They were in, again, what today is the nation of Turkey. And it was a Roman, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of soldiers there might have been, but it was known that there were 40 outspoken, bold Christians in that division, that grouping of the army. And they went to them and said, you are some of our finest soldiers, and this order has been given. Please go ahead and comply so that we can, keep you in our army, and, we'll honor you, give you awards and so on and so forth. And they said, no, we have no king but Jesus. And they put him in prison, probably starved him some, and, did different things to pressure them. All they had to do was say, Caesar is Lord, and worship the Roman gods. And everything would be just great. But they refused to do it. And so the time came, this is the middle of winter, they stripped the soldiers of all of their normal clothing, whatever garb, and they marched them out on the middle of a frozen lake. And on the shore, they put tents. with hot baths and fires. And they said, you'll be dead in the morning. But anytime you want to, you can leave this frozen lake. You can come and get warm towels, get in the warm water, and all you have to do is pinch that bit of incense, say Caesar is Lord, and worship the Roman gods, and everything will be great. Well, these 40 soldiers pulled together, and one of the legends is, and I think it's probably true, is that they were chanting during the night, 40 brave soldiers for Jesus. And in the middle of the night, one of the soldiers finally broke rank and ran to shore and went into the tent and did the obligatory worship of the Roman gods and that type of thing. But one of the regular Roman soldiers who had been guarding this group for weeks, he had been so impressed by the devotion, by the dedication, that I'm trying to think which one he is, because he's singled out here somehow, and I don't remember. But anyway, one of the Roman guards, when he saw the one guy defect, he threw off his armor, threw down his weapons, and went out and joined the Christians and died with them that night, because he'd been so impressed and so won over by their love, by their devotion, by their dedication. But this is just one sample of the what we call the imperial persecution. Now, there were dozens of Roman emperors, and not all of the Roman emperors minded the Christians. Some of the Roman emperors didn't care. Rome had pretty flexible religious. You could be any religion, they didn't care, just so long as you honored the Roman gods. And some of them persecuted Christians for different reasons, like Nero, the first one listed, 64 AD. He persecuted the Christians because he needed a scapegoat. Rome had had a massive fire. And it's likely that he was behind it because he wanted new building projects. But this fire burnt so much, destroyed so much of Rome, that opinion started to turn against Nero. And so Nero blames the Christians. And one of the things that Nero said is, see, if you look at what these Christians have preached, they've preached about how the world will end in fire. He used that. And it was under Nero that Peter and Paul were both put to death. And so that was the Neronian persecution. Domitian, the second one, is the one that sent John to the Isle of Patmos. And then you have others. But notice, it wasn't, you could have like between 64 and 90. There wasn't necessarily a whole lot of Roman persecution. There might have been little bits here and there, little outbreaks somewhere, but nothing big, nothing widespread. And then you go down to all these different ones. How many of you like the movie Gladiator? You like the movie Gladiator? They show Marcus Aurelius as this philosopher, king, Caesar, and all that. He persecuted Christians, so he's not that good of a guy, even though I liked him in Gladiator. But he did persecute Christians. And then you have others that persecuted at different times. The Decian persecution was very, very bad. Under Diocletian and Valerius was the worst of all. But one of the things we have to look at is that these persecutions, they weren't just all the time. And they weren't everywhere in the empire. It might be in, one place happening, but in another place in the Roman Empire, there were no problems at all. So it was usually local, usually localized, and it was usually sporadic, off and on, not all the time. I think the only one that was really empire-wide was the last one under Diocletian. But one of the emperors, Trajan, let's go back and see where he is. Trajan, see, he's the third one from 98 to 117. He got a letter from the governor in Pontus, a governor named Pliny, And Pliny was saying basically, I don't know what to do with these Christians. I don't know what to do with them. And he basically was asking the emperor, should we just go after them? And here's what Trajan said. He said, well, these people are not to be sought for. In other words, don't seek out the Christians. But if they be accused and convicted, they are to be punished. But with this caution, that he who denies himself to be a Christian and makes it plain that he is not so by supplicating to our gods, although he had been formerly, may be allowed pardon upon his repentance. So here's what this emperor is saying. Well, don't seek out the Christians, but if somebody tells you that somebody is a Christian, well, you have to arrest them, but ask them. Are you willing to repent? Are you willing to just worship if you're willing to worship our gods, then we'll just forget the whole thing. But if not, then we're going to have to punish you. In many cases, they weren't really interested in killing the Christians. As a matter of fact, some of the emperors began to realize, wait a minute, the more we kill the Christians, the worse we look, and the more they get emboldened in their faith. So what they would try to do is instead of just killing the Christians, they would torture them and try to get them to recant, to renounce their Christianity, to renounce. And sometimes they would require them, you need to curse Jesus with your mouth. And then you need to say Caesar is Lord and burn, And if they do that, all would be forgotten. So anyway, but what were some of the reasons, or what were some of the ways that they did persecute the early Christians? Nero, who was a real sicko, he liked to burn them alive. He would put them up on a pole and wrap cloth around them soaked in oil, and he would burn them as a torch to light his gardens. Sometimes they were required to worship the Roman gods. Sometimes a certain governor or individual would simply say, well, don't go after the Christians, just go after the pastors. Just find the leaders. Sometimes just the leaders were singled out. Sometimes they would go after the property of Christians. Find out who the Christians are, take their home away, take all their money, just take everything they have. The right of assembly was prohibited, employment discrimination. Sometimes you couldn't get a job if you were a devout Christian. You say, well, how would that happen? Well, many of the trades had what today we would call them unions. Back then they called them trade guilds. And every trade guild had a deity. In other words, if you were a copper worker, then you had to belong to the copper workers trade guild. And at the meetings, everybody who worked in copper had to worship the god of metal. Well, if you're a Christian, you can't go worship their god. So if you can't worship their God, you can't belong to the trade guild. And if you can't belong to the trade guild, then you can't work. So people suffered in terms of employment. Some were crucified, beheaded, fed to lions. Churches were destroyed. Bibles were burnt. The civil rights of Christians were suspended. I can't remember which emperor it was. It may have been Diocletian, but he said, we need to go through the Senate and we need to interrogate every senator and make sure there's no Christians in the Senate. And if there is, they're going to be, killed or expelled or whatever. And some of the emperors ended up even having to kill some of their own family members because some of the family members of the emperors had become Christian. So this is what was going on. You say, well, why were the Christians such a bother? Why did they care? Well, let's go through some of the reasons. The Christians were deemed treasonous. They were disloyal to the state. The Romans believed that the Roman gods were the reason that they succeeded as a society. So if the Christians refused to honor the Roman gods, then they're treasonous, they're traitors, they're disloyal. And so it wasn't so much just entirely a religious issue. The Christians were deemed unpatriotic because they refused to honor the Roman gods. And their thinking was, if you tick off the Roman gods, it'll bring judgment on our society. So they thought the Christians were a real problem. This is tied in very closely. They disrespected the Roman gods. This is very funny sounding to us, but the Christians were considered to be atheists because they didn't have any statues of their gods. And in the Roman mind, the statue represented the deity, so if you have no statue, you have no deity. So they thought the Christians were actually atheists. That was one of the accusations. They were deemed a threat to the social order. They were different. They were considered antisocial. They were considered stubborn. The Christians wouldn't participate in a lot of the things that other people in society participated in. If you went to a play, watch a drama, every drama opened with prayers to the god of the theater. They were just considered antisocial for not participating in things. They seemed exclusive. Christians, they went off and met privately by themselves. They had these secret meetings. And so that raised suspicion. But there's also, even today, one of the things that will get you in trouble in our society today is to have an attitude of exclusivity. In other words, what do you do with the fact that Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. You cannot come to the Father except through me. That's exclusive. You understand what I'm saying? What about what the apostles preached in Acts, chapter 4? For there is no other name given under heaven whereby we must be saved. Now, if you want everybody to like you in our society, be a pluralist. You know what a pluralist is? Oh, there's many ways. You have your truth, I have my truth. We all have truth. Buddha is the way, Muhammad is the way, Krishna is the way, Jesus is the way. All these roads, they all end up. See, if you just have that attitude, everybody will think you're progressive and you're open-minded. But if you say, I think Jesus is the only way to heaven, then you're a bigot. You hate everybody else. So the Christians were persecuted because they seemed exclusive. They were destroyers of families. That was one of the accusations of Christians. And you know what? There was some truth to that. Some families did get broken up because somebody became a Christian and they could not participate anymore in the pagan rituals with their families. And so the families got upset because that person, having become a Christian, messed up their family. But the reason we list this verse, you can look it up on your own, Matthew 10:34, Jesus said that was going to happen. There were going to be times where some person became a Christian and then the family would turn against them and so on. So this is a reason that they disliked. The secret meetings aroused suspicions. One of the things, and I don't know if I have, let me go back. They thought, two of the accusations against the early Christians, because these Christians would go and have these private meetings. And what they would hear is they'd hear them talking about love feasts. These Christians were having love feasts. And so rumors got spreaded that these Christians had orgies. That wasn't orgy. They're celebrating the Lord's Supper. But the outsider, and so, another thing, if some of that information got out, they were cannibals. Because they heard, they're eating somebody's flesh and drinking somebody's blood. They have orgies and they have cannibals. Man, these Christians are weird. They're unpatriotic. They break up families. They're disloyal. They don't respect the Roman gods. And so this is why. This is why. One thing about it, I will say this. The Romans could have cared less that they worshiped somebody named Jesus. The Romans had thousands of gods. So to add one more, they didn't persecute Christians because Christians worshiped somebody named Jesus. They persecuted Christians because the Christians wouldn't worship anybody else. They didn't care if they worshiped Jesus. What bothered them is that they wouldn't participate and go along with everything else that everybody else was involved in. Remember, and financial problems for others. Back in Ephesus, because people became Christians, the people quit buying the silver little statues of the gods. People become a Christian. Today, they quit buying drugs. The drug dealer doesn't like it. See, so these things can be transcendent of many different things. You remember we talked about Tertullian? He was the guy who coined the term Trinity. He's the guy that said what was the phrase? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Here's what Tertullian said. He said, they think the Christians the cause of every public disaster, of every affliction with which people are visited. If the Tiber, that's a river going through Rome, rises as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not send its water up over the fields, if the heavens give no rain, if there is an earthquake, if there is a famine or pestilence, straight away the cry is, away with the Christians to the lions. Meaning anything that went wrong in society, keep in mind, these people were still highly superstitious. So if there was some natural disaster, they had to find somebody to blame it on. And so if the Christians were no longer worshiping the Roman gods, well, see, that's why this disaster happened, because the Christians have ticked off the Roman gods. To keep the Roman gods happy, we now need to go after the Christians, and so that we won't suffer anymore from the hand of the Roman gods. Another statement that Tertullian made was, kill us, torture us, condemn us, grind us to the dust. Your injustice is the proof that we are innocent. The more we are hewn or cut down by you, the more numerous we become. The blood of Christians is seed. And that was the resolve. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting as I studied church history is, I'm a Bible teacher, so I'm very interested in doctrine, and I'm very interested in true doctrine, and I'm very interested in things being done according to the Bible. And I found out they had a doctrinal problem in the early church that I had never known about. And that was a controversy called dealing with the lapsed. Have you ever had a membership in something and it lapsed? What does that mean? You forgot to renew it. You were a member of such and such gym, but your membership expired. Well, there was a term that the early church used for people who basically renounced their faith under pressure. The ideal was that, you should hold your confession of faith even if they kill you. But many Christians, when the pressure got on, there were some Christians, as soon as a law was passed in the city, everybody has to come worship this emperor or whatever. There were some Christians, man, they just made a beeline for City Hall and said, I'll do it. Well, they were violating their faith. There were other Christians who would hold out. They would not renounce Jesus. They would not curse Jesus. They would not worship these other gods, but they were tortured. And under torture, they might say, okay, I give in. I'll curse Jesus. And they would do it, and they would have it public so that other Christians could see, wow, this guy was a a powerful Christian leader, and there he is renouncing his faith. It was done to demoralize the Christians. And so while many people were like the 40 martyrs who stood fast and held their faith and so on, there were some people that renounced their faith, and they were called the lapsed. And there was this went on for decades under different rulers. What do we do with the people who renounced their faith and they lived, and now they feel bad about it, and now they want to come back into the church? Well, numerous Christians were imprisoned, executed, including the bishops of Rome, Antioch, and Jerusalem were all put to death. And those who endured without renouncing their faith were called confessors. Confessors. Do you want to know who one of the confessors was? St. Nicholas, the guy we call Santa Claus. St. Nicholas, the real St. Nicholas, not the one, all the reindeer and North Pole and all that mess, but the real St. Nicholas was a pastor in modern day Turkey. And he endured prison, endured torture, and finally they let him go. Probably maybe a different emperor came in, they changed the laws or whatever. And when he came back to Myra, the city where he was pastor, the street was lined with people shouting, "Nicholas the Confessor has returned." So the confessors were the real heroes. They were the ones who never renounced their faith, even unto death. They held their faith. But the confessors, some of them were the most merciful. They said, look, we know it's not right to renounce their faith, but they were under pressure. They were in great pain. They were being tortured. Let's be merciful and forgive them. And guess who they used as an example? Peter. Peter renounced his faith 3 times. Peter said, I don't know who he is. I don't know Jesus. Even cursed and said, I don't know him. And these confessors, many of whom had been tortured, some of them had lost an eye, some of them, had bones broken that never, completely healed right, through torture and things. And some of these confessors were saying, look, we need to be merciful. But there were some other people. And by the way, some Christians obtained certificates through bribery. They might know somebody that worked down at the city hall, and they would go and slip them, some money and say, look, I'm a Christian. I can't do this thing of worship. But the government would give them a certificate that showed that they had complied. And so some Christians just slipped them some money and got a certificate saying they had sacrificed to the gods when they had not. And then other Christians renounced their faith, some willingly and some under torture. These were referred to as the lapsed. So some, including the confessors who had remained faithful under torture, advocated a merciful approach. Others took a far more strict approach and felt the lapsed should be banished forever from church. They were harsh. And some of them took the position, we'll forgive them on their deathbed. We'll forgive them on their deathbed, but not until. They have to live their whole life under the stigma of having failed under pressure. And there were individuals, I will tell you this, there were individuals who felt so bad for having renounced their faith that they went back to the authorities and turned themselves in and said, go ahead and kill me because it was much later. It is kind of different. We don't have to think about this much in our society, but this is what a lot of our spiritual ancestors dealt with. There was one of the individuals, I can't remember who it is, who had translated the Bible into the language of the people. Now, the institutional church of the day, that you don't put the Bible in the language of the people because only the priest can interpret the Bible. So we don't want the people knowing what the Bible says. Well, you know, if you have to build your organization by keeping people ignorant, that's bad. So they would put to death the people. Now, I'm talking much later in church history. They would put to death the people who had translated the Bible. And one of the guys who had translated the Bible into the language of the people, they tortured him. And he finally said, okay, I recant. What I did was wrong. And then he felt so bad about it later that he recanted his recantation. So they rearrested him and they tried to torture him again. And he said, no, I'm not going to recant this time. So they said, well, we're going to burn you at the stake. And he had a request. You know what his request was? He had used his hand to sign the original document where he said, I'm sorry for translating the Bible. So he said, before you burn me to death, I'm going to hold my hand in the fire that I signed that to show that I am not sorry that I put the Bible into the language of the people. And these are different people, some tough folks. But others took a moderate approach and advocated what's called penance. You know, you do some things to show you're sorry and come before the church wearing sackcloth and ashes, and then we'll have certain things for you to do to show how sorry you are, and then after a while, we'll fully reinstate you into the church. How many of you know about penance? That this is where penance came from. It came from the issue of the lapsed people who had renounced their faith under pressure, and this was kind of a moderate. You know, they didn't think we should just quickly forgive, but they didn't think, well, we should never forgive. So let's let them show how sorry they are and have them do these different things. And then if they do enough good works, then we'll reinstate them into the church. The doctrine of penance pretty much came out of this period of time. But real quickly, let's ask about today. What's going on in the world today? If you grew up in America like I do, if you have not traveled a lot outside of the U.S., you may hear occasional reports of persecution here and there, but persecution is reaching near genocide levels around the world. In today, 1 out of 9 Christians in the world experience high levels of persecution. We don't necessarily deal with that here in the States. But around the world, 1 in 9 deal with severe persecution. Every month on average, you can read these statistics, 345 Christians are killed for faith-related reasons. 105 churches and Christian buildings are burned or attacked. 219 Christians are detained without trial, arrested, sentenced, and imprisoned. According to the Pew Research Institute, over 75% of the world's population lives in areas with severe religious restrictions. And the U.S. State Department says that Christians in more than 60 countries face persecution from their governments or surrounding neighbors simply because of their belief in Jesus Christ. So this is not just an ancient history issue. Persecution's going on in the world today.